Hi everybody, welcome to chapter 10, Measuring a Nation's Income. This is the first chapter that you will learn about the pure macroeconomics indicators. So in this chapter, you will learn why an economist's total income equals its total expenditure, and also you learn how gross domestic product, which we call GDP, is defined and calculated. And you will learn about the breakdown of GDP into its four major components of consumption, investment, government expenditure, and net export. You will also learn about the distinction between the real and nominal GDP. And finally, you learn whether this GDP is a good measure of economic well-being or not. But before moving to macroeconomics, let's review the differentiation between the macro and microeconomics. In microeconomics, as you know, we study how households and firms make decisions and interact in markets. So the basic questions I usually ask in microeconomics are about how the consumers decide how much of each good to buy, how the firm decide how much output to produce and at what price to charge. And also, we learn about what determines the price and quantity of individual goods and services. And also, even we learn about how do taxes on specific goods and services affect the allocation of resources. On the other hand, in macroeconomics, we learn how basically the study of economic-wide phenomena, including inflation, unemployment, and economic growth. So the basic and usual questions are, how do consumers divide their income between spending and saving? And what determines the total amount of employment or unemployment? How to calculate the real gross domestic product, and how government can help the economy when unemployment rate is high. So basically in macroeconomics, we talk about the macroeconomics indicators such as unemployment, GDP, growth rate, and basically how the government policy can actually help to decrease the unemployment rate and increase the growth of GDP. So let's define the gross domestic product, GDP. GDP measures the total income of everyone in the economy. It measures the total expenditure on the economy's output of goods and services. So basically, for an economy as a whole, the income must equal expenditure. So it's basically in one side of the equation we have income, and in the other side of the equation we have expenditure. So both sides basically, they should be equal. The income equals to expenditure. So means that the total output and product are produced in one side of equation, or income for some are actually considered as expenditure for the others. And we actually learn about that here. So as you remember, in economics, we make the economy in a simple model and simplify the model. So one of the way to show the simple model is the circular flow diagram, which is a simple model of macroeconomy to illustrate the GDP as spending, revenue, factor, payments, and income, which includes basically, it shows the markets, households, and firms. So the market actually shows how households and firms interact in the market. So this circular flow diagram shows that how household spends all of their income to buy all goods and services from firms, and the firms in return pay factor of payments in terms of to the factors of production in terms of wage and rent. And all these actually transactions are faced in the market. So this is the simple, basically simplified economy, macroeconomy we have, which basically it's called the circular flow diagram that shows the two markets, main markets here. The market for goods and services at the top, and the markets for factors of production at the bottom. So what happened? The households buy goods and services from firms, and firms use their revenue from the sales to pay wages to workers, rent to land owners, and profit to firm owners. So the households basically spend their money. So in their basically when they are spending their money to buy the goods and services, in this side of the equation, this is called as an expenditure for household side, while it is a revenue income for firms. So as you can see, both sides are equal. So when the households are spending their money to buy goods and services in the market, so that's a revenue for the firms. So the revenue, the firms, they are in return giving the households the goods and services. They're selling the goods and services in the market, and basically the goods consumers and households receiving and consuming those goods and services. Now, in return, the households presenting or supplying their labor, land, and capital to the market, to the firms in the market for factors of production. So basically, the households, they supply their labor, and the firms, they demand their labor. And so the factor of production is supplied to the firms, and the firms in return of those factor of production, they are paying for the households' wages, rent, and profit for their labor, land, and capital. So that's how you can see that the income and expenditure are equal, because basically this is the flow chart. This is a simplified version of our big macroeconomics. And the GDP here equals the total amount spent by households in the market for goods and services. It also equals the total wages, rent, and profit paid by firm in the markets for the factor of production. So what is the measurement of GDP? How we can measure GDP, this gross domestic product? So to measure the gross domestic product, we have to consider the market value of all final, not intermediate, tangible goods and intangible services. So when we say that the market value of all final goods and services, means that we don't actually include the intermediate goods. if we are counting the final number of the BMW produced in the United States, you cannot actually double count by including the radio that is in the BMW or the mirror, which basically they're produced in different factories in the GDP, because in that case, you're double counting the GDP. So you can actually consider only once, and usually the best way is to count the final goods and services. For example, if the farmers are taking their agricultural product to the supermarket, you cannot double count by counting the farmer's product, agricultural product, and also the final product that the restaurant actually chef is buying from the store and preparing food for the customer in the restaurant. So that's why as an economist, you have to only count the final product and services one time and avoid any double counting by including the intermediate goods. And then second, when you're measuring the gross domestic product, you have to consider that that should be produced within a country. This means that even if the BMW, which is actually a German kind of manufacturing plant factory, but they are actually producing their BMW automobile in the United States and they're employing the American actually laborers. So they produce within the United States. So that should consider in the gross domestic product. There is another indicator, which is a gross national product, which actually is different that time, which we will talk about that later. But this is gross domestic, means that anything domestically produced within our country. So the other important factor you have to consider when you are calculating and measuring GDP is that it should be sold legally in the market. So any goods and services are in the black market and they're illegal is not considered in calculation of gross domestic product. For example, marijuana still is not legally exchanged, bought, and sold in the state of Maryland. So therefore, it is not included in the gross domestic product. So if for example, Maryland make marijuana's exchange and trade legal in 2021, then that would be included in the GDP in the Maryland, while it is actually legal in the other states, and so therefore that would be included in the measurement of GDP in the other states, such as Colorado. The other factor we have to consider in calculating the gross domestic product is it should be in a given period of time. So usually we calculate the GDP either in annually or quarterly. What are not included in GDP are intermediate goods and basically those produced and sold illicitly and those produced and consumed at home. So although the house production and housewives actually work is very valuable, but since there is no trade actually in the market, so therefore it is not considered in calculation of the GDP. So that's why there is actually joke that say that since I'm married to my hair styler, so the GDP actually decreased. So because there is no actually trade in the market for paying for my hairstylist anymore. So, or if the buying and selling marijuana will be actually legal in one state, so therefore the GDP actually increased after legalization of marijuana. So again, the measurement of GDP should be within a country, goods and services produced domestically, and regardless of the nationality of the producer. So could be actually Japanese, basically producers producing in the United States in a given period of time, a year or quarter. So, or a German manufacturing plant production in the US, such as BMW, Volkswagen, and Mercedes. And they basically employ usually about 50,000 American workers should be included in our GDP, right? Now, what are the components of GDP? So GDP usually included always. We always show that in economics with the letter of Y. So Y equal GDP is equal to the consumption plus investment plus government G, basically present the government purchases, plus net export, which NX present the net export. Now, the consumption is the consumption by households. This includes the durable and non-durable goods, such as groceries, clothes, and iPods. Now, the services are all the basically intangible, such as education, haircuts, and you know, if somebody is coming and cutting your grass, basically, these are all services. And in exchange, if they're coming and cutting your grass, and in exchange, you have to pay them, this is included in the GDP. But if your neighbor is actually cutting your grass as a just friendship, that is not included in the GDP, right? So it should be actually, there should be a production and basically should be exchange of money. So the exception would be purchases of new housing. Why? Because that actually considered as a kind of investment. So the consumption is basically all the durable and non-durable goods and services, including the car here, but not the houses. So the investment are those actually expenditure by businesses and households. Remember, to produce, we talked, one example would be housing, to produce other goods and services. So the definition of investments is what makes the investment different from consumption is that investments are those actually transaction that you buy basically goods and services that actually produce other goods and services in the future. So such as business capital, such as business structures, equipment, and intellectual property products that you basically buy them for your office business because you wanted to kind of run a business and you need this equipment, machines, computers to basically start your business. So these are the business capital. And then also the place, the building that you rent as a residential, so as a residential or as a basically business, this considered as a capital. Landlord's apartment building, homeowners, personal residence, these are all investment. And the inventory accumulation, the example would be, basically cars in the dealership. Even if all the cars that are produced into 2020 cannot be sold in 2020 and actually will be in the dealership for 2021, that is considered as a GDP in 2020 and is not included in the year 2021, although they have not been sold, but they had been actually produced in 2020, and they consider as an inventory in the in the GDP in 2020. Now, in the GDP, so we talked about the consumption, we talked about investment. What about the government expenditure, which we show by G, the government expenditure and gross investment by local, state, and federal government. So if your state of Maryland or federal government or your local, basically Baltimore County, is spending on goods and services, building roads and schools, these are all considered in the G, as a government expenditure. And but remember that this actual G does not include transfer payment such as Social Security and unemployment insurance benefit, because there is no actually production in this transaction. It's just from one transaction to another transaction, but there is no production of the goods and services. So therefore, this is not included in the government expenditure and gross domestic product, the Social Security and unemployment insurance benefit. The last component of GDP is a net export, which is the export minus import. It could be positive, it could be negative, or zero. So this actually considered as a value of the country's export minus its import from other nations. So let's give you an example of the component of U.S. GDP in 2015, which the GDP in the United States was about $18 trillion. When we say that the GDP in total was $18 trillion, it's very difficult to compare the GDP of the United States with the other countries, because every country has different population size. So therefore, we actually calculate the GDP per person. So what we do, we divide the $18 trillion divided by the population of the United States, about like 320 million people in 2015, and we come up with the $55,822 per person. So that actually GDP per person or GDP per capita gives us a more actually a clear size of the GDP per person. And you can compare the GDP per person in the United States compared to the GDP per person in European country, and with the people in Asia, and with people in Africa. And you can see that the highest GDP per person is kind of in the United States. And so you can compare how big is this share of the GDP in the United States compared to the most of the countries in Africa, 10 times, even more than that, bigger. So let's see the component of the US GDP in 2015. The first component, the consumption, was about 38,000 per person. So which actually, if you divide this 38,000 divided by 55,000, you get 56,000 almost. You get 68%, means that basically the biggest component of GDP is the consumption, which actually accounts for 68% of the GDP. Then the second component of GDP is investment. And that investment, it actually accounts for about 70% of the GDP. And the third component of the GDP is government expenditure purchases, which about 18% of the GDP. And finally, the net export, which is the export minus import, is actually usually is negative in the United States, negative 3%, which means that American spends more on foreign goods than foreigners spend on American goods. So we buy more from the other countries than the other countries altogether buy from us, which makes sense. So the United States, it's richer than the other countries, right? Now, again, if we wanted to look at the GDP and its component, so we have in 2015, so you can see that these are the components of GDP, and this is the percentage of them. And so if we put the, in the second column, if we put the total population of the United States, so basically you can actually divide and get the per capita or per person GDP. So that is much actually clear, I guess, if you put that and then divide this by population and get the per patient GDP. What is the difference between real versus nominal GDP? So the total spending rises from one year to the next. So basically, economy producing a larger output of goods and services, or goods and services are being sold at higher prices. So what is basically differentiate between the real GDP and nominal GDP is that the nominal GDP is the production of goods and services valued at the current prices. But the real GDP is the production of goods and services valued at constant prices. So basically, designate 1 year as a base year and not affected by the change in prices. Basically, the nominal GDP is including both change in the price and quantity of the GDP, but the real GDP only shows the change in the total outcomes, not the change in the prices. So how we can calculate this, then the real GDP means that you have to calculate, consider the base year, and then at the base year, if you just consider only the base year prices, then the nominal GDP would be equal to the real GDP. But since we have inflation, means that the prices over the time increase. So therefore, most of the time, the nominal GDP are greater than the real GDP. To actually measure the real GDP, how much really our total goods and services increase over the time, over the years in one specific year, then you have to look at these two nominal and real GDP in one specific base year to be able to actually look at the change in the real GDP over the time. And we show that by example. So the real GDP versus the nominal GDP, one of the ways we can actually differentiate is calculation of the GDP deflator. So the ratio of the nominal GDP to real GDP times 100 is 100 for the base year. Means that you can measure the current level of prices relative to the level of the prices in the base year. It can be used to basically to take this inflation out of the nominal GDP. How we can calculate that? The GDP deflator is equal to the nominal GDP divided by real GDP multiplied by 100. So it's not difficult, but the key point here, you have to remember that you have to, first of all, define what is the base year. And based on that base year, you can keep that base year as 100. And then based on that, you can see the change in the nominal GDP compared to the real GDP. And we show that by example. What is the definition of the inflation? Inflation is the economy's overall price level changes, increase in the economy's overall price level. And inflation rate is the percentage change in some measure of the price level from one period to the next period. So for example, the inflation in year 2 is the GDP deflator in year 2 minus the GDP deflator in year 1 divided by GDP deflator in year 1 multiply by 100. Remember, always the base year is in the denominator, and you actually subtract this base year from the second year to come up with the inflation year. And by example, this table can actually help you to calculate how to calculate the real GDP, nominal GDP, and the GDP deflator. Suppose that you have, in our simplified economic, we have only two products. We have hot dogs and we have hamburgers. So in 3 years of 2016, 2017, and 2018, we have the price of the hot dogs in the first column. We have the quantity of the hot dogs in the second column. And also we have the price of hamburgers in the fourth column and the quantity of hamburgers in the last column. So now we wanted to calculate the nominal GDP. The nominal GDP is so easy, means that in 2016, you have to just multiply the price by the quantity of the hot dog, 1 per hot dog, multiplied by 100 hot dog, plus 2 per hamburger, and multiplied by 50 hamburger, which is equal to 200. So easy, right? You're just multiplying the price multiplied by quantity of all the product at the same year. The same thing for 2017. You multiply the price of $2 per hot dog in 2017. So the hot dog increased the price from $1 to $2. And also the quantity increased from 100 to 150. So here, we don't know if the GDP actually increased, how much is based on the price and how much is based on the quantity. So then we have to find out in the next step. So the 2017 GDP is price multiplied by quantity of hot dog plus price multiply by the quantity of hamburger in 2017, equals 600. And then the same thing for 2018, $3 per hot dog multiplied by 200 hot dogs plus $4 per hamburger plus $150 per hamburger, which is 1,200. As you can see, over the years, the price of hot dog has been actually increased. That's the usual case, right? And also the quantity has been increased. The same thing for hamburger and the price and quantity of hamburger. So it's very difficult to say if the, what percentage of this GDP in 2018, the increase was related to the price and what percentage was related to the quantity. So calculating the real GDP helps us to understand basically what was the real increase in the GDP. So in 2016, you can see that we keep the prices if here the question tells you, or your basically future boss, you're hired as an economist in a board of labor statistics, and your boss is asking you, keep the base year as a 2016 and calculate the real GDP for 2017 and 18. So in that case, the real GDP for 2016 would be basically the same. If your boss was asking to keep the real base year in 2017, in that case, that 2016 GDP, real GDP was also changing. But right now, based on the base year 2016, we keep the price of the hot dog all at the price of the 2016 at $1. So we put the price $1, $1, $1 for hot dog, and we keep the price for hamburger at $2, $2 in 2016, $2 2017, and $2 in 2018. The quantity would be basically based on the year. In 2016, the quantity was 100 hot dogs. In 2017 was 150, and in 2018 was 200. And in here, the quantity was $50 in 2016, $100 hamburger in 2017, and 150 hamburger in 2018. So multiplication and summation gives you the $200 in 2016, which was the same at the base year. The real and nominal GDP are the same. In 2017, the real GDP was $350, and in 2018, the real GDP was $500, which basically the difference would be, basically between nominal GDP in 2018, 1,200, and real GDP 500. So if you wanted to calculate the GDP deflator, then you have to divide the nominal GDP divided by real GDP multiplied by 100. So in that case, the 2016 GDP deflator would be 200 divided by 200 multiplied by 100. And the GDP deflator for 2017 would be 600 divided by $350 and multiplied by 100, which will be 171. And GDP deflator for 2018 would be 1,200 divided by 500 multiplied by 100, which will be 214. Now, if you wanted to calculate also the growth rate of the real GDP from year 2017 to year 2018, in that case, you can actually subtract the the real GDP from the nominal GDP, and then divide by nominal GDP in year of 2017. And that actually gives you the growth rate of the real GDP from 2017 to 2018 in percentage. The inflation rate from the 2017 to 2018 would be can be calculated by GDP deflator in 2018 minus GDP deflator in 2017 divided by GDP deflator in 2017 multiplied by 100. Remember that in all these percentages, when we are actually calculating 1 year based on the previous year or base year, the base year is in the denominator, and also we subtract the new year from the previous year, divided by the previous year or the base year to calculate the inflation rate or the basically growth rate. This is another example of the county of Austin produces 2 goods, footballs and basketballs, with the following prices and quantities of output for 3 years, year 1, 2, 3. Now, so these are the prices for the football, quantity for football, and then we have the prices for basketball and quantity for basketball. So the nominal GDP in year 1 will be very easily multiplication of the 10 price by quantity plus price by quantity of the football and basketball, right? The same thing for year 2, we have the multiplication of the price and quantity of football plus price and quantity of basketball. And the same thing for year 3, we have the multiplication of price and quantity of the football plus price multiplied by quantity of the basketball. That gives you the GDP, nominal GDP in year 3. Now, using the year 1 as a base year, then here you keep the prices of the year 1, $10 and $12. And now you wanted to calculate actually the real GDP. So the prices would be $10 for football, and for basketball, the price would be $12. And then you actually replace the quantity for year 1, 2, 3, and year 1, 2, 3 here. And that actually gives you the, using year 1 as a base year, gives you the real GDP year 1, 2, 3. So basically the prices are based on the year you consider as a base year, and you look at the change in the quantity, so that gives you the real GDP. Note that the nominal GDP rises from year 2 to year 3, but not real GDP, and real GDP falls. So interestingly, in this example shows that, basically, when you're using the price changes in different years, it shows that there was a change in the nominal GDP from 3,600 to increase to 6,900, and that increased to $7,470 in year 3. But when we actually cleaned up the price and inflation, we noticed that by considering using the year 1 as the base year, we had an increase from year 1 to year 2 of the real GDP from 3,600 to 5,600, and then we had a decrease to 5,100. So basically that changing the price level into year 3 was the reason we had an increase in nominal GDP, not changing the real quantity. So then also we can calculate the GDP deflator for year 1 and 2 to basically get the inflation rate. Now we are going to go to the basically the half century of real GDP. So the real GDP grows over the time, and that's usually the case for all the countries. So over the long term, the trends for GDP growth is always positive. So the real GDP of the US economy in 2015 was more than 4 times than it was in 1965 level. And that's actually the same for most of the country. All the countries, they had increase in the real GDP. So the growth for the United States was the average of 3% per year since 1965. So the growth is not steady, and the real GDP growth interrupted by recession. So there are basically a lot of ups and downs, but the trend usually is positive. So what is the definition of recession? Recession is defined as 2 consecutive quarters of falling GDP. So if there are basically the first quarter we had a recession, and then the second quarter we didn't have the recession, but the third quarter again we had a recession, that is not considered as a recession. Should be 2 consecutive quarters of a decrease in the GDP to consider as a recession. And also we look at the real GDP to count it as a basically whether that's a recession or not. So that actually shows the lower income, rising, usually recession comes with the lower income and rising unemployment. Of course, there are 2 sides of the equation again, and you will see that in future chapters. Falling profits, increased bankruptcies, as you can see recently in the COVID-19 actually lockdown, increased bankruptcy. There have been 33 recessions since 1854, and two since 1945, and recession have lasted for 11 months on average. So usually, basically, on average, as we mentioned, the average was about 18 months since 1945. Now, what is the definition of depression? Depression is the more severe downturn that lasts for years, not the quarters, right? So that's the difference. So there has been only one depression, the Great Depression, which lasted a decade. So the last depression, and hopefully we never see that again in our lifetime or even later. So as you can see, the real GDP in the United States, as well as in all the actually other countries, always the trend is positively sloped upward. There are ups and downs. As you can see, there are recession and booms, but it's always actually rising positively upward for all the countries. And of course, the growth rate is different in different countries. The average for the United States is 3%. So the GDP, why GDP is so important? Because it is a single base measure of the economic well-being of a society. So it's actually economy's total income. total expenditure, um, and what is actually indication here of the GDP? The GDP indicates a larger GDP indicates a good life, better healthcare, better educational system, is a measure of ability to obtain many of the inputs into the to the worthwhile life. So it's a good measurement. So it's not a perfect measure of well-being because it doesn't actually include the non-monetary outcomes or transaction, for example, leisure time. While leisure time is very important because we have to actually um, take a break to be more productive in the labor market. Or the value of the almost all activity that take place outside the market, for example, the household activities, whatever you work actually at home as a housewife, as a cooking, building something at house, as long as it's just work, your work, without purchasing anything, of course, from outside, then that doesn't actually consider, it's not counted. The housewives, motherhood, and taking care of children is not considered, is not counted in GDP. But if the mother hire a babysitter and actually there is an exchange of money here, that then that is actually considered, it's counted in the GDP. So it should be actually a transaction here to be counted in the GDP. So it's not a perfect measure of well-being, of course. And so it doesn't take into account the quality of the environment. So if an entrepreneur doesn't care about the environment and the entrepreneur's actually factory is polluting the air, so the GDP only actually take into account the dollar value production of that factory and is not taking into account the air pollution that factory actually is producing in the environment. And it doesn't say anything about the distribution of income. So these are actually the problem in the measurement of the GDP. But so the international differences between GDP and quality of life, the rich countries, if we wanted to see the rich countries with the higher GDP per person, at the end is the best actually indicator we have, because the rich countries with the higher GDP per person, they have a better life expectancy, literacy, they are educated, and they have an internet usage. Compared to the poor countries with the lower GDP per person, which they have, lower, basically worse life expectancy, they live shorter, we live basically longer in the rich countries, and their level of literacy is lower with the lower GDP in the poor countries, and they don't have the number of the people they have access to the internet usage is lower. So it's a best indicator of the basically quality of life. We can say that in terms of life expectancy, literacy, internet usage at this time. So the low GDP per person, if you look at the different, basically data, you can see that those countries with the lower GDP per person, they have a more infant with low birth weight, higher rate of infant mortality, higher rate of maternal mortality, and also higher rate of child malnutrition, less common access to the safe drinking water, which is the most important actually factor for the healthy population in a country. They have fewer school-age children, those countries with the lower GDP per person, fewer teachers per students, fewer television, telephone, paved road, and households with electricity. So now how we can actually increase this growth in GDP? One is by growth in the population. So of course, more population means that more labor in the market. But, you know, these more population and more labor doesn't mean that all the population, they can be participate in the labor force. So the most important factor is that we increase the labor force participation. Basically, we can encourage the female to come and join the labor force. We can actually improve the productivity of each labor output per worker. For example, by giving capital per worker, by giving a computer to each worker, we can actually increase the productivity of each workers, or by educating them, we can actually increase the productivity of the GDP per workers. So, and if we wanted to basically, again, compare the GDP and quality of life in different countries, we can see that the United States, by about $53,000 per person per capita, this is before 2015, has the highest GDP per capita among the countries are ranked here: Germany, Japan, Russia, and the lowest one here is Bangladesh by 3,191. So if we look at the life expectancy, so the United States has the higher life expectancy, although there are some exceptions here. For example, Germany has a little bit GDP per capita, but has a higher life expectancy. But still, you can see the association or correlation between the real GDP per capita and life expectancy, that as the real GDP per capita decreases here, you can see that the life expectancies are lower with the lower GDP per capita. The same thing for average years of schooling is lower for countries with a lower GDP per capita, and the overall life satisfaction, of course, are lower for the countries with the lower real GDP per capita. So in summary, why, based on the learning objectives, we are summarizing what you learned actually in this lecture. Why an economy's total income equals to its total expenditure, because it's basically there are two sides of the equation. An economy's income must equal its expenditure, because every transaction has a buyer and a seller. Thus, expenditure by buyer must equal income by seller, income to seller, right? And also how gross domestic product is defined and calculated. The gross domestic product is a breakdown, is in 4 major components of consumption, investment, plus, this should be plus here, plus government expenditure, plus net export, which is export minus import. The 4 components of GDP are consumption, and then we said that as a purchase of the, for example, DVD, investment, such as purchase of the computer by a business, or the house basically we are buying for as a consumer is considered in the investment, or the G government purchases, such as an order for families' aircraft, basically, and the net export is such as the sale of the American wheat to Russia. We also talked about the distinction between the real and nominal GDP, and you learned that the rise in nominal GDP can be caused by increase of the production or higher prices or both. And we can actually differentiate between this by looking at the real GDP compared to the nominal GDP. Economists use the real GDP rather than nominal GDP to basically assess the economics and well-being, because the real GDP is not affected by changing prices. So it reflects only changes in the amount of being produced. And the real GDP is a good measure of the economic well-being. That's the best measurement indicator that we have right now. That's why in most of the economic project, that's the first actually indicator we look at it when we are comparing different countries, even in healthcare. So there is a high correlation between the higher GDP per person and better life expectancy, literacy, and internet usage. Thank you.